These were years of tightening ropes woven from land loss, forced labor, racial laws, and the slow choking of a people's dignity. By this time, the British had entrenched themselves in the fertile heartlands of central Kenya, carving out what they called the White Highlands. These were vast, rolling lands of rich red soil and cool mist, lands that had belonged to the Gikuyu, Embu, and Meru people long before the first railway sleeper ever touched Mombasa. The settlers arrived with papers, but the people they found living on that land had only memory, tradition, and ancestral claims, and so the British declared the people's ancestral homes Crown Land. This meant every hut, every ridge, every grazing path suddenly belonged not to the families who had lived there for generations, but to a distant government thousands of miles away. Displaced families were pushed into crowded and shrinking native reserves. Imagine a man who once had acres to graze his goats, now having barely enough land to scratch for food. The soul grew tired, hunger crept in, and tempers began to stiffen as the settlers took more and more land. The colonial government introduced labor systems that turned free people into a workforce for European farms. To force people into this labor, they introduced taxes. There was the hut tax, the poll tax, and the Kaponde tax. These taxes forced Africans to work for settler wages just to pay them, or face severe punishment if they couldn't. This is where the story of humiliation becomes clearer. The Kaponde, a tin can identification pass, was introduced in 1915, but it hit the GEMA communities hardest by the 1920s and 30s. Every adult African man was forced to wear it round his neck, like a cowbell. This pass contained his fingerprints, his employer's name, and his employment history. Without it, the police could arrest you on sight. It dictated your movement, your work, your freedom. It even dictated your sense of self-worth. Some called it the chain of the African. The Gikuyu people especially, proud and deeply rooted in their ancestral lands round Kirinyaga, Moranga, Kiambu, Nairi, and the slopes of the Abudes, felt this humiliation most intensely. A man who had once walked freely between the ridge and the river now needed permission to travel from one village to the next. Meanwhile, the new settler farms and estates thrived, coffee plantations expanded, European towns like Nairi, Nanyuki, Thompson's Falls, and Delred grew into centers of white wealth. Africans built these towns, but they were forbidden from living in their centers. The tension simmered. But it had not yet boiled over. Then came World War II. Young African men Gikuyu, Meru, Embu, Kamba, Luo, and others were recruited or forced into the King's African Rifles. They traveled to Ethiopia, Burma, Somalia, and Madagascar. They fought Italians in Moya and Kismayo. They marched through jungles under enemy fire, and out there, far from home, they saw something that made them question the entire colonial order. They saw Europeans fighting and dying. Just like them, they saw Indian soldiers defy British officers. They saw that the British Empire was not invincible. When these soldiers returned home in 1945, with medals on their chests, they expected respect. Instead, they were met with the same Kaponde, the same land hunger, the same forced labor, and even fewer rights than before. But now, these men had military training, discipline, and a broader understanding of the world. They would soon become a critical backbone of the movement to come. At the same time, back in the villages, children grew thinner, families fought over shrinking plots of land, and the forest edges crept further into farmlands as people desperately searched for resources. Whispered gatherings began to take place under fig trees, in huts, and in the dark corners of Nairobi's African quarters like Pamwani, Kerio Kor, and Makadara. They spoke of lost land, of injustice, of stolen cattle and broken promises. They spoke of the chiefs who were appointed by the British to enforce these unfair laws. And quietly, a new fire flickered to life, the fire of voting, a sacred act meant to bind the oppressed together in a common cause. The promise was simple: I will fight for land, for freedom, and for the dignity of my people. Leaders began to emerge from these shadows: thinkers, rebels, war veterans, and young radicals. They knew that the conflict ahead would demand sacrifice, strategy, and forest hideouts deep enough to swallow entire armies. Because the era that followed was the birth of the Mau Mau uprising, a storm that had been decades in the making. Thank you for watching. In our next part, we'll explore the birth of this resistance and the figures who led it from the shadows into the light. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss it.